Think your grocery bill is high? Medieval peasants had it worse. There were no supermarkets, no imported blueberries in January, no delivery app, just whatever you could grow, gather, or barter for. And you had to do it while working from sunup to sundown, through plague, famine, and a workload that would make a modern fitness influencer cry into their protein shake. And forget variety. These weren't meals so much as survival strategies. If something grew in your patch of soil, you ate it until you were sick of the sight of it. If you had a pig, you stretched it until only the squeal was left. If the harvest failed, you found yourself staring down a winter of dried beans and prayers. We're talking about the 15 cheap foods that kept generations alive, not because they were delicious or balanced, but because they were the only things standing between you and the churchyard. Meals that were often bland, sometimes unpleasant, and occasionally actively dangerous. Yes, your dinner could poison you, and no, you didn't always have the luxury of turning it down. Think you could survive on the same pot of stew for 3 months, not as a challenge, but because there was no other choice. Imagine lifting the lid each day to find the same grey-brown slurry, slightly thicker in some places, slightly thinner in others, with a few new scraps bobbing at the surface like survivors clinging to driftwood. You'd eat it because you were hungry, and you'd be hungry again before the bowl was empty. Or picture this. It's midwinter, and the only bread in the house is so hard you could use it to repair the roof. You chip off a piece with your knife, dunk it in ale until it stops threatening your dental health, and hope it's just the yeast making those black spots, not mold. This was food in the medieval world, edible enough to keep you moving, just dangerous enough to keep you guessing. Picture yourself now, sitting at a rough wooden table in a one-room cottage. The roof leaks in 2 places, the floor is packed with dirt, and the smell of wood smoke and boiled cabbage has permanently woven itself into your clothing. Your dinner is in a bowl in front of you. It's not so much served as ladled, a thick, lumpy mixture that's been reheated so many times it could qualify for an apprenticeship. This is pottage, the never-ending soup that was yesterday's meal, last week's meal, and, with a few new scraps added, tomorrow's meal too. This was the reality for the overwhelming majority of people in medieval Europe, the peasants, villeins, serfs, and labourers whose entire existence revolved around producing food, only to eat the simplest, cheapest forms of it themselves. While nobles feasted on roast meats, imported spices, and fresh white bread, you got dark, dense loaves made from whatever grain was left after the lord's share was taken, and possibly a generous helping of ground peas, acorns, or straw mixed in to make it last. If you're imagining some kind of rustic, Instagram-worthy farm-to-table spread, let me stop you right there. This was not artisan bread. This was not a quaint country stew with a sprig of rosemary on top. This was keep the family alive until spring food. Meals designed to be filling, not exciting. Food you could make in one pot over a smoky fire while keeping an eye on children, livestock, and the ever-present threat of your neighbour borrowing from your cabbage patch. The calorie math was brutal. A working man needed over 3,000 calories a day just to keep up with the demands of ploughing, planting, and harvesting, more during peak seasons. That meant huge portions of bread, porridge, and pottage, supplemented with whatever vegetables, beans, or scraps of meat could be found. Variety wasn't a concern. If you had the same thing 3 times a day, that was stability. If you had nothing but watery gruel for a week, that was famine knocking at the door. And yet, these foods worked. They kept people alive long enough to work the fields, raise families, and survive wave after wave of plague and bad harvests. They were the backbone of the feudal economy, the quiet, unglamorous fuel of the medieval world. Tonight, we're going to go through them one by one. The humble, sometimes horrifying, always practical foods that sustained the peasant class for centuries. We'll talk about the never-ending pottage, the rock-hard rye bread, the cabbage that doubled as currency, the beans that kept you alive but made church awkward, and the salted herring that followed you around for days in the form of your own breath. Before we get started, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening tonight? And what time is it for you right now? There's something oddly comforting about knowing that somewhere else, at this very moment, another person might be lying in bed, drifting into sleep, while learning about medieval food that could probably double as construction material. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. Let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. That's the story I'm telling tonight. If medieval peasant life had a mascot, it would be pottage. Not because it was glamorous. It wasn't. But because it was always there, waiting for you at every meal, like that one co-worker who insists on joining every lunch break. Pottage was a thick, hearty stew, at least in theory. In practice, it was whatever you could get into the pot without collapsing the economy of your household. It started with the cheapest grain you could find: barley, oats, rye if you were feeling ambitious. And then you'd add whatever vegetables were on hand: turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage, carrots, peas. If you were lucky, maybe a small scrap of bacon or salt pork for flavor. Meat here doesn't mean big chunks you could sink your teeth into. It means a thumb-sized sliver so fatty it could lubricate a cart axle, boiled until it dissolved into the broth. The beauty of pottage was that it never ended. You didn't empty the pot at the end of the day. You just added more water, more vegetables, maybe a handful of grain if you had it. Yesterday's pottage became today's pottage, became next week's pottage. It could live on your hearth for days, weeks, sometimes longer, slowly evolving in taste and texture. A noble household's pottage might be perfumed with imported spices, tender cuts of meat, even a splash of wine. A peasant's pottage smelled like boiled cabbage and tasted like whatever you managed to scavenge on the walk home from the fields. It was fuel, plain and simple. A working man might eat 2 or 3 pints of pottage a day, spooning it up with chunks of bread or simply drinking it from a wooden cup if there wasn't time for anything fancier. And you needed that fuel, ploughing a field by hand, hauling water, and chopping wood burns through calories faster than a modern-day gym session, without the benefit of a smoothie afterward. Of course, the persistence of pottage was both its strength and its downfall. The longer it simmered, the more it developed character. In the absence of refrigeration, character could mean anything from a pleasantly rich depth of flavor to a mysterious tang that hinted at bacterial ambition. But when food was scarce, you didn't get picky. You told yourself it was ripe and kept eating. In its own way, pottage was the great equalizer of the medieval world. Everyone ate it. Nobles just had better ingredients and better tableware. For peasants, it was the culinary equivalent of a workhorse, unglamorous, tireless, and indispensable. And like a workhorse, it was never really allowed to rest. Would you get bored of it? Absolutely. Imagine having the same stew for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for months at a time. Imagine watching your children push the same limp cabbage leaves around their bowls for the 3rd meal in a row. But you'd still keep making it, because pottage didn't just feed your stomach. It kept you alive through cold winters, bad harvests, and days when the only alternative was watery gruel. Modern cooks talk about slow food as if it's a luxury. For medieval peasants, slow food was the only food. And if you were very lucky, your pottage would be just thick enough to feel like a meal, but thin enough to stretch for one more day, and one more after that. If pottage was the soul of the medieval peasant diet, bread was its backbone, dark, dense, and, depending on the week, either barely edible or actively trying to kill you. Forget the fluffy white loaves you see in bakery windows today. That was noble bread, made from the finest wheat flour the Lord's miller could sift, baked fresh every morning. Peasant bread was something else entirely. Rye or barley if you could get it, mixed with whatever fillers you had on hand to stretch the grain. Peas, beans, acorns, chestnuts, tree bark, even straw. If it grew in the fields or could be ground into powder without breaking your millstones, it went in the dough. And speaking of millstones, the grain you did grow wasn't yours to grind freely. Milling was a privilege controlled by your lord, and using his mill came with fees, sometimes a portion of your grain itself. Want to try grinding it at home to avoid the charge? That could get you fined, or worse, depending on how much the lord enjoyed setting example. The result was bread that was heavy enough to double as a blunt weapon and dry enough to make chewing an endurance sport. You didn't just slice peasant bread, you hacked it into chunks, dunked it into pottage or ale, and waited for it to soften enough to chew without snapping a tooth. This wasn't a crust you fought through to get to the soft middle. The entire thing was the crust. Bread wasn't just food, it was sacred. In a world where famine could knock on the door any season, wasting bread was seen as a sin. Stealing it was punished harshly, and in bad years, bread riots weren't just a possibility, they were expected. It's not hard to see why, when a working man might eat 2 to 3 pounds of bread a day, easily accounting for more than half his daily calories. But bread could also be dangerous in ways modern eaters rarely think about. Rye, a common grain for peasants, was vulnerable to a fungus called ergot, which thrived in damp harvest. Eat enough of it, and you develop St. Anthony's fire, a condition that would cause burning sensations, hallucinations, convulsions, and, if you were really unlucky, gangrene in your limbs. Imagine trying to work the fields while your hands turned black and fell off, all because you had no other choice but to eat the bread in front of you. Still, bread was life. It travelled with you into the fields, was eaten at every meal, and could last for days if you baked it right. Peasants typically baked once a week, using communal ovens if they were lucky enough to have one in the village. The rest of the time, the loaves hardened into something closer to a building material than a food. It might sound grim, but bread in all its forms, from the nobleman's soft white loaf to the peasant's brick-like rye, was the one constant on every medieval table. If pottage was the hot, bubbling heart of the diet, bread was the reliable, slightly stale heartbeat that kept you alive. You didn't have to love it, you just had to eat it, every single day of your life. If pottage was a meal and bread was a meal's backbone, gruel was, well, more of a suggestion. It was food in the same way that a scented candle is light. Technically, yes, but not enough to work by. Gruel was what you made when you had almost nothing left in the pantry but the faint hope of calories. Take a small amount of oats, barley, or whatever grain scraps you could sweep off the mill floor, boil them in a large amount of water, and keep boiling until you could at least pretend it was edible. If you had a pinch of salt, congratulations, you were eating luxury gruel. Most days, it was just warm, bland liquid, with a few swollen flecks of grain floating in it, like survivors clinging to driftwood. The purpose of gruel wasn't to satisfy hunger, it was to silence it. It was the culinary equivalent of putting a bandage over a broken door hinge. It didn't fix the problem, but it might stop the noise for a while. Peasants turned to it when bread ran out. Pottage was down to an unidentifiable sludge at the bottom of the pot, and famine had stripped the cupboards bare. It wasn't just peasants who ate it. Monks used it during fasting periods, stretching a cup of oats to feed 10 people when discipline was valued over comfort. Medieval healthcare also loved gruel. It was fed to the sick and elderly because it was easy to digest, which is really just another way of saying there's nothing here to digest. In slightly wealthier setting, you might find it laced with herbs or even a splash of wine to strengthen the patient. This didn't make it taste better, but it did make them care less. And yes, children got gruel too, often as the first step after weaning, because it was soft and cheap. Parents weren't aiming for balanced nutrition here. They were just trying to fill little bellies without using up the good bread. In desperate years, gruel might be the only thing a child ate for weeks on end. As for taste, imagine a thin, watery porridge that somehow manages to be both slimy and gritty at the same time. Even medieval dogs, who were not known for their culinary selectiveness, could turn their noses up at it unless they were starving. Gruel didn't spoil quickly, mostly because there wasn't much in it to spoil. So you could make a big pot and ladle it out until your household lost the will to chew. It wasn't satisfying, it wasn't exciting, and no one ever looked forward to it. But when the choice was between gruel and nothing at all, gruel won by default. In the hierarchy of medieval food, it was firmly at the bottom, but it was still better than the empty space on the table. If you were a medieval peasant, you wanted friends who were dependable, and in the garden, that friend was the turnip. It didn't matter if the soil was poor, the weather uncooperative, or the farmer distracted. Turnips would grow anyway, quietly multiplying underground, like they had nothing better to do. From a single seed, you could get up to 15 pounds of food. That kind of return on investment was nothing short of miraculous in the Middle Ages. They were so reliable that a family of 4 needed about 200 pounds just to get through the winter. And no, that wasn't an exaggeration. These roots were your insurance policy against starvation. They could be stewed, boiled, mashed, or thrown into pottage, and when the leaves were fresh, you could eat those too. Even the flowers were edible because nothing went to waste. The downside? Eating turnips every day meant you could identify the smell of reheated turnip stew from across the village. It's not the kind of scent that makes people gather around the table eagerly. It's more the scent of resignation. But when the choice was between eating turnips again or watching your children's ribs stick out more each day, you boiled the turnips. And you were grateful. They stored well in cool, dry cellars or in pits dug specifically to keep them through the winter months. In lean years, these pits were guarded like treasure chests because losing them meant losing the bulk of your calorie reserve. Turnips even had medicinal uses. Their juice was given for coughs, and poultices were made for skin ailments. Not that these treatments worked miracles, but in a time before antibiotics, people were willing to try anything. Turnips weren't glamorous. They didn't inspire feast day songs or appear in royal banquets. But they were there when you needed them, and in the medieval world, that meant everything. If turnips were the dependable friend, cabbage and onions were the loud, opinionated cousins. Useful, but you knew when they'd been in the room. Cabbage was the backbone of peasant cooking. A single head could weigh up to 15 pounds, and you didn't even have to harvest it all at once. You could peel away the outer leaves for daily cooking and let the inner head keep growing. That made it perfect for stretching meals across the seasons. Fresh, it would last weeks in a cool place. Sliced, salted, and fermented into sauerkraut, it could survive for months without spoiling, which meant you could have vegetables in midwinter without relying entirely on turnips. Onions were the multitaskers of the medieval kitchen. They grew in poor soil, stored easily without any special preparation, and doubled as pest deterrents when planted among other crops. They flavored soups, pottages, and meat dishes when meat was available, and sometimes served as the dish themselves. An onion roasted over a fire with a drizzle of vinegar was a rare, flavorful treat for a peasant family. These 2 ingredients were cheap, reliable, and nutritious, but they came with a social cost. They lingered. A heavy cabbage and onion dinner could make the air in a small, smoky cottage even less breathable than usual, and doctors for the wealthy sometimes advised their noble patients to avoid poor people's plants altogether. Of course, for peasants, those poor people's plants were the reason they lived long enough to irritate their doctors. Cabbage and onions were even valuable enough to serve as barter. If you owed someone a small debt, a sack of onions could settle it. In some cases, they were a form of tax payment. That's how essential they were. Edible currency. And in a world where coins were scarce in peasant hands, you couldn't ask for a more practical form of wealth, even if it did smell up your storage room. For a medieval peasant, meat was a sometime, a feast day luxury, a gift from a generous neighbour, or the result of an accidental hunting trip that you absolutely didn't want the Lord to hear about. Day to day, protein came from humbler sources, and at the top of that list were peas and beans. Dried peas in particular were the unsung heroes of the medieval diet. They packed about 25% protein, which meant they were a rare plant-based way to keep muscles working through long days in the fields. They were easy to grow, fixed nitrogen in the soil for the next crop, and could be planted between rows of grain or after a harvest to make the most of every scrap of land. Cooking them wasn't glamorous. Soak, boil, mash, repeat. But they kept for years if stored in a clay pot or wooden barrel. Add salt or a handful of wild herbs, and you almost had a dish worth looking forward to. Almost. Peas and beans were famine food, feast food, and everyday food rolled into one. Monasteries relied on them heavily, especially during the many days each year when meat was banned for religious reasons. In some households, the big pot of pottage was essentially just beans, with a few other vegetables added for variety. The only real drawback? Let's just say these were not ideal foods to eat before church or a court appearance. In small, crowded spaces without much ventilation, you knew when the bean harvest had been good. When medieval peasants ate meat, they rarely got the prime cuts. Those went straight to the Lord's table or to market for people with enough coin to pay for them. What trickled down to the peasant kitchen was offal, the parts of the animal no one else wanted. Organs, feet, heads, scraps, anything you could scrape, boil, or chew if you were determined enough. A pig's head could be boiled until the meat from the cheeks, ears, snout, and lips fell away into the pot. The brain might be mashed and mixed with breadcrumbs to make a kind of rustic pâté, although no one was calling it that. Cow stomachs could be chopped up and boiled for a haggis-like dish, or stuffed with oats and spices if you could afford them. Sheep lungs and blood might become blood pudding, served in slices that were more filling than they were appetizing. In desperate times, meat might include small game like squirrels, hedgehogs, or even rats. Hedgehogs were singed over the fire to remove the spines before being stewed. Rats were skinned and cooked in much the same way as rabbits. In very bad years, peasants would eat badgers and foxes. Hunger is a powerful motivator. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled for broth. Fat was rendered for cooking or making candles, and hides were tanned for leather. Every part of the animal had value, and taking more than your share was theft punishable by fines, public shaming, or worse. Offal didn't keep well, so it had to be eaten quickly, salted, or smoked before it spoiled. That meant it was often on the menu in large, filling portions immediately after an animal was slaughtered, followed by a return to beans, bread, and turnips until the next time fortune, or the slaughterhouse, smiled on you. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't pretty. But offal was proof of the medieval peasant's determination to get every possible meal out of every possible resource. You could turn your nose up at it, but only if you had the luxury of something better to eat. If there was a medieval equivalent of a fast food chain, it was the salted herring trade. Herring swam in massive schools, so massive that a single good catch could haul in millions of fish. They were easy to net, easy to preserve, and could be transported far inland without spoiling, which meant that even if you lived days from the coast, there was a decent chance your dinner had once been part of a herring's tightly packed commute through the North Sea. Preservation was simple. Gut them, pack them in heavy salt until the fish was more brine than flesh, and seal them in barrels. The result had a smell so powerful, entire districts of port cities were devoted to the trade just to keep the aroma contained. For peasants, salted herring solved several problems at once. It kept for months, travelled well, and most importantly, met the strict requirements of religious fasting days, when meat from warm-blooded animals was banned. In a world with more than 100 such days a year, fish became essential, and herring was the cheapest, most available option. You could eat it straight from the barrel if you didn't mind the salt shock, or soak it in water to make it more manageable. Some people chopped it into spreads or pies. Others just gnawed at it with bread and called it a meal. There were two main types: white herring, which was simply salted, and red herring, which was salted and smoked. The latter not only preserved longer, but also had a smell so distinctive it later became a metaphor for distraction. It was filling, it was portable, and it was reliable. The only drawback: once you'd eaten it, you carried the herring with you, in your breath, for hours, possibly days. In small, poorly ventilated medieval homes, this was a detail your family couldn't ignore. In the medieval world, you didn't drink water unless you had no other choice. Not because people were hydrating with trendy alternatives, but because water could kill you. Wells were easily contaminated, streams could carry disease, and boiling every drop wasn't practical for a household already spending most of the day just keeping food on the table. Ale solved the problem. Brewing required boiling the water, and the low alcohol content, usually between 1% and 3% for small ale, made it safe to store for a short time without going bad. It wasn't just for adults either. Children drank small ale daily, much like modern kids drink milk or juice. A gallon a day for a working adult was normal. During harvest season, the intake could be even higher. It was made from grain, often barley, mixed with water and fermented with yeast. Brewing was typically women's work in peasant households, and it was done once or twice a week. The ale had to be consumed quickly before it spoiled, which meant it was a constant part of daily life. You might have it with breakfast, carry a flask to the fields, and finish the evening with more. It wasn't just hydration, it was calories. Ale contained enough carbohydrates to help keep you going through long hours of labor, especially when paired with bread, a combination that formed the foundation of the medieval diet. Ale also served as currency in small exchanges. Payment in ale for services, from mending a fence to ringing the church bells, wasn't unusual. In many ways, it was the social glue of the medieval village. And after a long day of hauling, digging, and planting, a mug of ale was as much about comfort as it was about safety. Of course, if you drank enough of it, the comfort part could become a problem. But for a medieval peasant, being slightly buzzed was still safer than being slightly poisoned. Most medieval peasant meals were practical, repetitive, and about as exciting as watching laundry dry. But every now and then, something came along that felt like a treat, not because it was fancy, but because it broke the monotony. Cider and mead were two such rare pleasures. Cider was the more common of the two, especially in areas where apple grew well. Apple trees, once planted, could produce for decades with minimal attention, which was ideal for people who didn't have spare time to fuss over orchard management. The process was straightforward. Crush the apples, collect the juice, and let it ferment naturally. The result could range from mild, almost fruity water to something strong enough to knock you flat, with the stronger versions usually saved for special occasions. For daily drinking, cider was often made weaker, just enough alcohol to keep it safe to store without going bad. In areas without barley for ale, cider filled the same role, safe hydration that also delivered a bit of flavor and calories, and, if you weren't careful, a headache the next morning. Mead, on the other hand, was the special guest star of the medieval drinks menu. Made from honey, water, and yeast, it's one of the oldest known alcoholic drinks. But honey wasn't cheap for peasants. Unless you kept bees yourself, it was expensive enough to make mead a once or twice a year indulgence, often tied to festivals, weddings, or other events worth remembering. For those few days, the drink's golden sweetness was a reminder that life could taste better than boiled cabbage. Both cider and mead served practical purposes. They preserved sugars, added calories, and stored well. But their real value was in morale. After months of grey porridge and darker bread, a sip of something sweet and rich could feel like a small victory. In a medieval peasant's diet, sugar wasn't just rare, it was practically mythical. Refined sugar was a luxury for the rich, imported at great cost and hoarded like treasure. For everyone else, sweetness came from two sources: honey and whatever wild berries could be gathered in season. Honey was the undisputed king of sweetness. If you kept bees, you could harvest it yourself, though harvest in this case meant risking multiple stings and possibly losing your hive to bad weather or disease. Wild honey could be found, but tracking it down was a skill, and taking it was a gamble. Once you had it, honey was valuable enough to be listed in wills, used to settle debts, and even traded for goods. Beyond sweetening food and drink, it was used medicinally, spread on wounds, mixed into tonics, or stirred into herbal remedies. Wild berries were the seasonal treat. Strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, and raspberries could be gathered in the warmer months, often becoming a community activity. Children might be sent out with baskets to collect them, though most children operated on a one for the basket, one for me policy. Without sugar, berries couldn't be preserved easily, so they were eaten fresh or occasionally dried in the sun for later use. Honey and berries were more than just flavor. They were a reminder that food could be about enjoyment, not just endurance. And in a year of unrelenting monotony, pottage, bread, beans, repeat, a spoonful of honey or a handful of berries could feel almost decadent. When the grain stores were low and the turnip pit was looking dangerously empty, medieval peasants had one last insurance policy: the forest. And in the forest, nothing was more valuable than nuts. Chestnuts were the true prize. Naturally sweet, easy to roast or boil, and starchy enough to be genuinely filling, they could be dried and ground into flour, earning them the nickname bread tree in some regions. In parts of Europe, chestnuts made up as much as 20% of a peasant's winter diet. They were so important that they showed up in tax records. Yes, the local lord would happily take his cut of your nuts, and no, he wouldn't see the humor in that sentence. Acorns were also eaten, though they required more effort. Packed with bitter tannins, they had to be soaked or boiled multiple times to make them edible. During good years, people didn't bother with them. In bad years, they became a staple, mixed into grain flour to bulk out bread. The resulting loaves weren't delicious, but they kept you alive, and that was the only standard that mattered. Gathering nuts was a seasonal scramble. Once they fell, you had to get to them before the wildlife did, and the competition was fierce. Squirrels, birds, your neighbors, everyone wanted the same pile of calories, properly dried and stored, often buried in sand or hung in bags in a dry loft. Nuts could last for years, making them one of the few truly long-term food sources available. Foraging wasn't a hobby in the Middle Ages. It was a skill that could mean the difference between making it through the winter or ending up as a name on the parish's died of hunger list. The forest, meadow, and hedgerow were full of edible plants if you knew where to look. Nettles were a common find, picked in spring for soups and pottages. Sorrel, with its lemony tang, could liven up an otherwise grey meal. Mushrooms were gathered too, though with the constant risk of accidentally selecting the kind that would have you meeting your ancestors by nightfall. In summer, you might collect wild garlic, dandelion greens, or watercress. In autumn, hawthorn berries, elderberries, and sloes could be picked, and either eaten fresh or brewed into rustic wines and cordials, the kind of drinks that made long winter evenings just a little more bearable. Foraging wasn't just for the very poor. Even well-off peasants and smallholders took advantage of wild foods to stretch their larders and add variety to their diets. But it carried a social shadow. If you were seen foraging in the dead of winter, it was obvious you were running out of stored food, and that kind of information traveled fast in a small village. Still, in a world where the word seasonal wasn't a marketing gimmick, but a fact of survival, wild foraging added crucial bursts of nutrition and flavor to a diet that might otherwise have been a continuous loop of grain and cabbage. For a medieval peasant, the enemy wasn't just hunger, it was time. Having food in August was easy. Having food in February was the real challenge. Preservation wasn't optional, it was survival. Drying was the simplest method. Apples, beans, peas, mushrooms, and herbs could be laid out in the sun or hung above the hearth until all the moisture was gone. Properly dried, they could last months, sometimes years, if kept safe from moisture, pests, and the occasional curious child. Smoking was another standby, especially for meat or fish. It didn't just preserve the food, it infused it with a flavor so strong it could overpower even the most persistent hint of spoilage, which was useful because spoilage happened. The same went for salting. With enough salt, you could preserve herring, pork, or even cheese far longer than nature intended, though the result could be almost inedibly salty unless you soaked it first. Fermentation worked wonders for vegetables. Cabbage became sauerkraut, turnips could be pickled, and even milk could be turned into something stable like hard cheese. These weren't gourmet luxuries, They were insurance policies. And then there were pits, literal holes in the ground lined with straw or leaves, where root vegetables could be stored in a naturally cool, damp environment. They weren't perfect. Some food rotted, some was stolen, and some sprouted before you could eat it. But for many households, those pits kept them alive until the first green shoots of spring. Life as a medieval peasant was one long grey stretch of the same foods on repeat until it wasn't. A feast day could transform the village table overnight. Religious festivals, weddings, and successful harvests brought out foods you might not see again for months or even years. Roast meat appeared in portions big enough to actually taste it. Fresh bread, warm from the oven, made the rounds. Honey cakes or fruit tarts might show up if someone had been saving up precious ingredients. Ale and cider flowed freely, and the usual rules about portion control disappeared for a night. But the real magic wasn't just in the feast itself, it was in the leftovers. After a feast, you might find yourself with scraps of meat to stir into the pottage, or a bit of lard for cooking. Even bones had value. Boiled into broth, they could stretch into several meals. For a week or two after a feast, the usual monotony was broken, and the cottage smelled just a little more inviting. Still, the cycle always returned. The pottage pot kept bubbling, the bread hardened, the beans boiled again, the herring reappeared, and peasants went back to doing what they did best, making the same foods last day after day, season after season, year after year. Because in the end, survival wasn't about loving what you ate, it was simply about having any food at all. So there you have it, 15 foods that fed the medieval peasant world. They weren't glamorous, they weren't exciting, they didn't show up on gilded platters or inspire epic poems, but they worked. Day after day, season after season, they kept people alive through winters that didn't care if you were tired, through harvests that sometimes failed without warning, and through years when the plague came closer than comfort. Every bowl of pottage, every crust of rye bread, every salted fish and dried bean was a quiet act of endurance. And maybe that's the real story here. Not the foods themselves, but the people who ate them, who worked until their hands split open and still managed to get up the next morning to do it all again. They didn't have the luxury of variety or excess. What they had was enough, most of the time, and when it wasn't, they found a way to make it enough. It's strange to think about, isn't it? In their kitchens, smoky, dim, and smelling faintly of cabbage, these same foods would have been shared, argued over, laughed over. They were the backdrop to life's biggest moments. Births, deaths, marriages, festivals. Meals weren't just calories. They were the thread that stitched one season to the next, one generation to another. So tonight, as you drift off, maybe picture that table. The uneven boards, the wooden bowls, the loaf with yesterday's knife marks still in it. Outside, a wind that smells faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Inside, the slow comfort of knowing that tomorrow's meal, whatever it is, will come from the same pot, the same loaf, the same hands. Because for a medieval peasant, routine was more than survival. It was home. If you're still listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, hopefully by now you're drifting away slowly. Good night. Script written by Clara Finch, because some stories still deserve a soul.